A stranger laughs at your car. You're loading groceries into a 10-year-old sedan. The bumper has a scrape you've stopped noticing. The cart rattles as you lift the last bag into the trunk. A man walking toward a newer SUV glances at your car, smirks, and quietly laughs before climbing into his own. 5 years ago, that tiny laugh would have followed you home. You would have replayed it all night. You would have imagined rolling down the window to explain that the old car was temporary, that bigger things were coming, that he didn't know who you really were. Today, you close the trunk, drive away, and by the first red light, you've already forgotten he existed. That change didn't happen the day you became wealthy. It happened somewhere much earlier, somewhere between chasing approval and no longer needing it. But almost nobody notices the moment that shift begins, because before wealth becomes quiet, it gets incredibly loud. 5 years ago, you made just under $30,000 a year. Your apartment was small enough that the kitchen and living room felt like roommates. Every paycheck already had a destination before it arrived. Yet one Saturday afternoon, you stood in front of a shoe store mirror wearing a pair of pristine white sneakers with an oversized designer logo stitched across the side. Price, $220. Your monthly car payment was less than that. You bought them anyway. Not because they were comfortable, not because they would last longer, because for the first time in months, when you looked down, you looked successful. You cleaned them for every outing. You walked around puddles. You checked your reflection in every storefront window just to see how strangers might see you. Then your sister's birthday arrived. You slipped a greeting card into her hands. No cash inside. She smiled anyway. You didn't have to get me anything. She meant to make you feel better. Instead, those words stayed with you all week. Because deep down, you knew the truth. The shoes had taken the money that could have helped someone you loved. But somehow, you still didn't regret buying them. That contradiction confused you for years until you realized something uncomfortable. You weren't buying shoes. You were buying proof. Proof that you weren't the struggling kid everyone thought you were. When your bank account couldn't tell your story, your possessions tried to tell it instead. And that's a dangerous habit, because once your identity depends on what people notice, you'll spend your entire life performing for an audience that never applauds for long. The strange part? It actually works. People notice. Compliments come. For a while, you finally feel seen. Until, one day, being noticed stops feeling like enough. Years passed. Your income climbed past $120,000. The apartment became a modern condo. The old sedan disappeared. A leased German car sat in the driveway. The inexpensive sneakers became polished leather shoes. A luxury watch wrapped around your wrist. Everything looked exactly like the life you'd promised yourself. Yet something unexpected happened. At DinnerWorks, you laughed a little harder whenever successful people joked. You caught yourself mentioning vacations that didn't need mentioning. You subtly angled your wrist so the watch caught the restaurant lighting. Not because you loved the watch, because you wanted someone else to notice it. One evening, halfway through dinner, you looked around the table. The people laughing the loudest weren't your oldest friends anymore. Those friends had quietly disappeared. Not because anyone argued, not because anyone drifted apart intentionally. You simply stopped inviting the people who couldn't appreciate the symbols you'd worked so hard to collect. Without realizing it, you had replaced friends with an audience. Money had solved your first insecurity, only to hand you a much more expensive one. You no longer worried about looking poor. Now you worried about looking ordinary. And that prison was even harder to escape. But everything changed at one dinner you almost didn't attend. By then, your investments had quietly grown to around $500,000. This wasn't salary anymore. This was wealth you actually kept. You stood in front of your bathroom mirror, adjusting your expensive watch one final time before leaving. Tonight, you thought, you finally looked like you belonged. The dinner was held in a private dining room. 8 people, successful entrepreneurs, investors, business owners. You immediately noticed something strange. No designer logos, no flashy watches, no luxury suits. The oldest man at the table, someone worth far more than everyone else combined, wore a faded sweater and a plain canvas watch strap that probably cost less than your dinner. You waited for someone to compliment your watch. Nobody did. You mentioned a recent deal you'd closed. Someone nodded politely, then changed the subject to a family camping trip. Conversation drifted toward children's schools, favorite books, weekend hobbies. Not a single person competed. Not a single person performed. Driving home, you stopped at a red light. Without really thinking, you unclasped the watch, placed it in the center console, and drove the rest of the way home without it. Because for the first time, you understood something no motivational quote had ever taught you. The higher the room, the quieter wealth becomes.
The people still trying hardest to look rich usually aren't. And the people who truly have nothing left to prove rarely feel the need to prove anything at all. That realization changed how you saw success forever, but it didn't prepare you for what happens after people know you finally have money. Then came the part nobody talks about. Crossing your first million didn't change how you saw yourself nearly as much as it changed how other people saw you. Your oldest friend called one Friday afternoon. Want to grab a beer? Nothing unusual. He'd known you before the promotions, before the investments, before anyone cared how much you were worth. For the first hour, everything felt exactly the same. You laughed about old mistakes, talked about people you hadn't seen in years, complained about getting older. Then he grew quiet. His fingers slowly rotated the glass in front of him. He cleared his throat. There's this investment opportunity. There it was, the sentence he'd been carrying all evening. You listened. The amount wasn't unreasonable. You helped him. But as you drove home, it wasn't the money you kept thinking about. It was those 4 silent seconds before he asked. The hesitation, the rehearsed courage, the uncomfortable realization that maybe the beer had never really been about the beer. You'll never know if that's true, and that's the part that hurts. Because once doubt enters a friendship, it never completely leaves. That conversation quietly rewired your brain. A week later, an old classmate sent a message. Hey, it's been forever. We should catch up. 5 years ago, you'd have smiled. Now your eyes automatically searched the text for what wasn't written. Did he need advice? A loan? An introduction? Another message arrived, then another. People you hadn't heard from in years suddenly remembered your number. Some genuinely missed you. Some probably didn't. The tragedy was you could no longer tell the difference. Money had bought freedom, but it had quietly stolen something almost impossible to replace, the ability to meet every conversation with complete innocence. And that's when something surprising happened. Instead of wanting more people to notice your success, you started hiding it, not because you were ashamed, because you were exhausted. You stopped mentioning what you owned, stopped wearing the expensive watch, stopped explaining your investments. One evening, you attended a small dinner with people who barely knew you. The conversation wandered from family vacations to favorite recipes to someone's dog that kept escaping the backyard. 2 hours passed. Nobody asked what you did. Nobody asked what your house looked like. Nobody asked how much you made. Driving home, you felt something you hadn't expected. Relief. Real physical relief. For years, you believed status meant being recognized everywhere you went. Now, the greatest luxury wasn't being admired. It was being forgotten. You once spent thousands of dollars trying to become impossible to ignore. Now anonymity felt priceless. And once you experienced that feeling, there was no going back. Years later, your investments quietly crossed $5 million. Oddly enough, life looked simpler than it ever had. Friends came over on Saturday afternoons. Someone talked about their daughter starting school. Another complained that his dog had destroyed another pair of shoes. Someone recommended a vacation spot. Someone burned the burgers. Everyone laughed. Hours passed. Not once did anyone mention money. Nobody compared watches. Nobody discussed cars. Nobody cared who was worth what. Money had become the least interesting thing in the room. For years, you thought wealth meant upgrading everything around you. Instead, it had upgraded the conversations you no longer needed to have. That was the destination nobody tells you about. Not luxury, normal. The kind of normal money can never buy directly, only make space for. A few weeks later, you were washing your old sedan in the driveway. Yes, the same old car. The paint had faded a little more. The scratch on the bumper was still there. Your neighbor walked past, smiled, and joked, "When are you finally going to buy yourself a real car?" 5 years ago,
You would have laughed awkwardly before finding some clever way to mention your investments. Maybe you'd casually hint at your income. Maybe you'd explain it was a choice. Anything to make sure he understood. This time, you simply smiled. It still gets me where I need to go. Then you walked inside. No explanation, no defense, no desire to win the conversation. Because the person who needed strangers to understand no longer existed. There's a mirror in your hallway. For years, it was part of your routine. Before leaving the house, you'd stop for just a second, straighten the jacket, adjust the watch, check the shoes. Not because you cared how you looked, because you cared how you would be judged. Every reflection was really a rehearsal for someone else's opinion. One morning, carrying your coffee toward the kitchen, you walked straight past that mirror. Not intentionally, you simply forgot it was there. Hours later, you realized something strange. You hadn't looked. You hadn't even thought about looking. The mirror hadn't disappeared. The audience had. And with it, the version of yourself that constantly asked, "What will people think?" Finally, there was one last lesson waiting where this story began. Saturday morning, the grocery store. You stood in front of a display of tomatoes, gently pressing one with your thumb exactly the way your mother taught you years ago. "Never squeeze," she'd always say. "The good ones don't need force." A man reached beside you. "Excuse me?" He picked 2 tomatoes and kept walking. He never looked twice. He had no idea who you were, no idea what you owned, no idea what your investments were worth. And then something almost invisible happened. For the first time, you realized you had never wondered what he thought of you. The old mental habit, the one that measured yourself through strangers' eyes, never even started. It was simply gone. That was the real finish line. Not the first million, not the 5th, not the old car, not the watch. Freedom was having enough money to impress everyone. Freedom was reaching a day when impressing anyone no longer crossed your mind. Because the richest people aren't always the ones with the biggest bank accounts. Sometimes they're simply the ones who no longer need to be seen.